Hello and welcome to episode 1 of series 3 of our UKRG Conversations. We are recording on Friday, 22nd of May. I would like to introduce Helena Rodwell, Assistant Conservator Collections Care at the Fitzwilliam Museum, and Ciarán Lavelle, Head of Collection Services at the National Museum of Northern Ireland. Helena completed her MA in Preventive Conservation at Northumbria University in 2011. After completion of her MA, Helena worked for the National Trust, English Heritage and Sir John Soane's Museum before joining the Fitzwilliam Museum as Assistant Conservator Collections Care in 2016. Ciarán is an object conservator with extensive field experience from Central Asia to the heritage collections of the Antarctic. Since October 2019, he's been Head of Collection Services at the National Museums of Northern Ireland, overseeing the conservation, technical, registrar, documentation and archival roles. They have agreed to field questions from us concerning aspects of handling, quarantine, and realities, or otherwise of virtual supervisions of the loans that we have to have recovered or installed. So thank you very much again. And we will press straight on with the first question, which is, with real plans being made to recover loans, people are trying to reach a procedure on receiving and dispatching shipments. What do you think are the main concerns for the interaction between the home team and the transport team?
So I think communication is going to be such a very important aspect to how we work with other organisations, having an understanding of their working practices. And we all have to develop new working processes and working protocols during this time. And working with other teams is understanding how they work and how we can safely interact and across each other.
Helena, do you have anything to?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about how you're interacting between transport and the team at the organisation, museum, whatever it is. So a lot of the discussions, as Ciarán mentioned, you can discuss in advance about how the organisations are working and try and amend any procedure accordingly. In terms of your own site, it's thinking about the logistics of it as you would normally. So how are they getting on site? How are they telling people that they're on site? Who's their first point of contact and what instructions they're going to get as soon as they arrive? So are you telling people to stay in their vehicle until someone comes out to meet them? How are you going to get that messaging across that, you know, whatever procedures you have on site? And also how you communicate what the procedure will be to offload any crates or collections from the van. So who's going to be doing that? Are you going to ask the transport agents to do that, or do you want to ask them to open up and the home team does it? So it's all these logistics that you can talk about in advance, but it's worth thinking about on site, who's going to give these instructions and also who's going to oversee it and take control of it. Certainly, like at the Fitzwilliam, sometimes it can be more than one person that greets a loan coming back. So making sure there's one person that they know that they are taking charge of the procedure and can stop it or make amendments according to what's going on.
Just to follow up on that, could you see the value in at least a rough or a template set of guidelines that might be applied reasonably across the board within the UK and further afield into European venues?
Well, I certainly think we can draw up some rough procedures, so protocols, who's going to be taking it off the truck, who's going to be handling it. I think there'll be certain aspects that will have to be site specific, and I'm mainly thinking about sites where perhaps you're offloading in a public area, or if you're lucky enough to have a closed off area, it might be a bit simpler. So there's some aspects I think that they're just simply going to have to be site specific, and it also depends on the amount of staff you've got as well. But yeah, there's certain protocols that you could use over different sites, I think. I don't know if Ciarán has an opinion on that.
I think there's opportunity here to draft guidelines for best practice, but as Helena says quite rightly, it will depend on the site location itself and the limitations or the where you can work. I mean, if you have a small loading bay, for example, you might only have to limit the number of people in it. If it is a public space, does that mean closing the space off from the public? And that brings in barriers. That might bring in supervising security. So there's a lot of aspects to individual sites that can't be drawn into a specific guideline for all sites, but having a draft guideline for how people communicate and plan, and especially those transition periods where the transit team meet the institution team, and who does what in that situation, who's in charge, who calls directions. I think there is scope for guides for best practice.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next one. So what do you think needs to be borne in mind about the handling of packed and unpacked objects, in particular with the use of personal protection and cleaning solutions?
I think as a standard, and I think this goes in line with certainly the UK government guidelines, is using the normal PPE that you would usually use for health and safety, obviously. I think the main aim is to limit the amount of contact while still being practical. So when we're thinking about PPE, I think it's important, obviously, to ensure that you're reading the guidelines from places like your local governments and also the World Health Organization about what is necessary. And certainly at the moment, there's some vagueness about things like face masks and things like that to keep people safe. So it is risk-based, and regardless of what kind of handling protocol you put in place in regards to PPE, it still comes down to the basics of enabling people to wash their hands before, during, after, and how that can be built into the procedure. And when it comes to the transport team as well, is how are you going to enable them to do that as well? So it's one thing having your staff wash their hands, but you're going to ask the transport team as well to do so, and how do you get them in the building to do that safely? And then certainly when it comes to cleaning solutions, obviously, as a conservator, it's kind of trying to limit the amount of cleaning solutions around collections. And it's, I think you have to be clear about what the risk is that you're trying to reduce and what is the potential impact that has on collections. And if it's going to be minimal, so if you're talking about cleaning handles, is it really going to be worth it? You're still going to have to wash your hands before and after. So it's a really tricky balance. And I think you need to have the baseline protocols in place, and anything above that needs to be really carefully risk assessed and managed.
I think quite rightly, I think understanding of the levels of PPE required and having strict kind of guides to what we should and shouldn't be doing is important. I think it is important also to state that safe handling of the collection cannot be compromised by measures to protect it against COVID-19, because it defeats the purpose of the of correct handling. I think we are lucky in the profession that we work at a high standard, as it is, and a lot of companies involved with moving the collections do work at a high standard. It's just it's bringing in new systems to increase that standard, from particles in the air, from breathing, from masks, face coverings that will help us. The type of chemicals we use, that's a difficult one to kind of pinpoint. As Helena says, as a conservator, we try to limit the kind of chemicals we use for health and safety reasons alone. It does bring in the importance of good planning and high level of risk assessments for all people involved. So again, that communication between the organisations and the middle party, the company who handles the transit, how do they operate with us, and making sure that we all follow the same guides. I think we are at high level anyway. It's just adding that extra level of precaution. For example, we're working at the moment in our own organisation on a big collections move, and so our object handling team, who would normally work in teams of 4 plus, we are now starting to organise, okay, how do we work safely together? So organising our teams, separating into teams of 2, so we limit interaction between all members of the team, which means also that we're a bit more flexible, not just in the object move, but also in any loans we have to deal with, that we have 2 separate teams that don't interact as much, and we're able to work safely with each other. But we're still not fully, we don't fully understand the complications that will arise from, if you're moving a painting, for example, if you're supposed to keep a metre or 1.5, 2 metres, depending on the guidelines. If the meters are, the painting itself is only 1 metre in width, then the possibility of moving that is limited, according to current guidelines. So we have to come to an understanding what is practical and what is safe. PPE comes into this, but good organisation, good planning, and the use of risk assessments to make sure we have looked at all scenarios and all opportunities.
We spoke a little bit about this, I think, in the run-up to the conversation as well. But I mean, what are the implications for timetabling, therefore, if you're doing installations and de-installations, if tasks or the requirements of working in proximity mean that tasks can't be multi-layered as they would ordinarily be in the gallery space?
Yeah, I'd say I mean, museums don't exactly have the reputation of working quickly, but this might slow things down. And I think this is where the risk assessments, we're going to talk about risk a lot, I think it's going to come up a lot, but they're so useful, first of all, to organise your thoughts about what kind of procedure you're trying to develop, but it's also a really good tool for communicating the risks to your organisation and why the mitigations you put in place are necessary, and the inevitable impact that will have on timetabling.
What advice would you give in reaching a compromise between a reasonable quarantine period for loans or objects arriving to reduce transmission risks against the need to unpack and condition reports soon after their return?
This is interestingly, this is a question that kind of divided some of my team in terms of some were saying, well, we do the full 72 plus hours for the virus to dissipate, compared to those who said, no, we need to see the object quickly, especially if we don't have a courier or we can't use couriers in the situation. Your knowledge of the state of the collection during transit is limited, and you're relying on third-party information to know your collection is safe or a loan coming in is safe. So I think in that situation, there is no easy answer. There is no, this is how it should work. For me, the possibility is to bring in one person, wearing the right PPE, open up where possible any crates, assess the collection, and then leave it in quarantine soon after it arrives, just to confirm that it's in good condition, but also limit the exposure to one person and not a whole team. So there is scenarios that we can look at to kind of come to a compromise. But I think quarantine is essential. It's just that access to that quarantine area might be limited.
Helena, what do you think?
Well, I agree that it's a tricky balance. And in terms of what you plan to do in your organisation, it may come down to how comfortable you are leaving collections packed for a lengthy period of time. And it may be on a case-by-case basis. So something perhaps that is particularly vulnerable. You can't wait that 72 hours. I mean, most places have the normal acclimatization protocol anyway, but it is that tricky balance between what is safe in regards to COVID-19 and what is necessary to do your condition checks and sign it off. And I think when we're talking about quarantine, it doesn't necessarily have to mean you have a separate room that you put things in, because some places just simply don't have the space for that. But, you know, in quarantine might mean that you put it in a space and you put a barrier around it with a sign saying when it was accepted and who handled it and when it's acceptable to handle it again. So yeah, quarantine doesn't have to mean it's locked up somewhere. But yeah, as Green said, it's about limiting the contact with it. So you're lucky if it's a small loan coming in. If it's a large loan, it's just that bit more complex, and unfortunately you are going to have to think a bit more carefully about how many people that risk is being put on, and ensuring those people who do it are comfortable with the procedures as well.
Thank you. So this is a feature that is gaining momentum now. So what, in your view, are the pitfalls and advantages of remote or online supervisions?
It's new to me in many respects. I know it happens in the past, and especially for small loans, it's quite common where an organisation is sending a small number of objects. They might rely on a sister organisation who are also taking part in the exhibition to monitor that collection for them on their behalf. But to do it on a bigger scale, I think it's a case of when you're moving from a trusted organisation to another trusted organisation to a trusted courier company, you already have that relationship built. You already have that understanding that, okay, we've worked with you in the past. There's a high standard of expertise and a high standard of quality that we're getting from them. And you know who's on the other side collecting it, and vice versa. I think it's easier when you're working in those situations because you already have built that. But when you're working with organizations you have limited knowledge of, and with companies that you have, again, limited knowledge of working practices, then it's a bit more difficult. I think with the pros, with the team tasked with the transit, you would expect them to take extra care, and with the increased responsibility that they have, maybe develop new aspects to their offering. So, you know, not just being a transport company, but being a courier transport company, and be holding those courier responsibilities. So you can imagine that would be one step up of offering that a company could offer. It does allow for social distancing because you have a small team working on it from point to point. And with the technology and the ability for detailed reporting and documentation and direct connectivity, a quick phone call, a video conferencing, there is good potential there. The con side of it, in supervising remotely, it might hinder consistent practices, and it might cause misunderstandings. As we all know, emails and phone calls, you don't exactly get the right response that you're expecting from, because maybe there's a language difference, maybe there's a difference in the law and practices that you're dealing with. You also, when you have a courier, you have contingencies in place. You have someone who can react on the time. But what if something goes wrong, the procedures and guidance and best practice aren't followed? How would you know? Where's your bottom line going? Did you do this? Yes. Did you really do this? No. We don't know, and there's that level of unknown that will always be there.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and it may vary loan to loan as well as to how much you're willing to take that risk. As Ciarán said, it might be that you've got a really good established relationship with the other institution, in which case that's great. On a practical side, for anything like that, certainly I've worked in places, I work in places now where my mobile phone signal and my Wi-Fi signal drops off a cliff when I'm in certain areas of the building. So you know, think about these things when you're building it into the procedure. If you're having to be on the phone with an institution while you're overseeing the movement of a collection, are you actually going to have phone signal? So it's real practical things like that. And it all as well comes down to documentation. So first of all, make sure you've got the best condition report you can have. If you've got all the photos you need. Certainly when I'm working with collections that I haven't condition reported or I'm not as familiar with, I'm relying solely on everything that's been written down and photographed to assess it. And also record keeping. So making sure that whoever you're asking to oversee this is recording what they're doing, whether that's through photography, if photography is allowed, or, you know, a questionnaire, survey, tick list type procedure. And how are you going to get that information back? So if someone's taking loads of photos on their personal device, how are you going to get that information back to you and secure? And I think it's also worth thinking about not only your own stuff, but also what is it you can offer other organisations. So some organisations just may not feel comfortable to take that responsibility on, but some may feel that they've got enough staff and they've got enough expertise in-house to do that. So it's also thinking carefully about what you as an organisation can do yourselves and offer other institutions.
I think of necessity, we're right at the start of this process, aren't we, of trying to manage in practical terms how these things will work, and we'll perhaps have to develop some models over the coming weeks about what will work in terms of who's observing and how documentation is swapped and so on. So I think we'll have to possibly revisit this in future discussions and share what we've learned. So at that point, thank you both very much. Thank you, Helena. Thank you, Ciarán, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for your time and for watching. Keep in touch, stay up to date with the UKRG Twitter feed and with the e-bulletin, and hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.